Welcome to lesson number 3 in the C# from start to finish course. I am Tim Corey, and today we're looking at data design. Now, we've already set up the boundaries for our application, the requirements that drive how the application gets built. And we've kind of built a little bit of a structure, but now we're going to take those requirements and build an actual data structure. Now, at this point, some people may say, I've seen it done differently in other lessons. I've seen some people design the front end first and then develop the data later. And that's true. Some people like to design how the application looks first, and then from that, it helps them decide what to do with data. I've done that before, but I've found the best success for me comes when I design the data first. And here's why. Your application is nothing without data. In fact, your application is just a vehicle to display, manipulate, change, and save data. Now think about that for a minute, because at first it sounds wrong. So start thinking through some examples. Let's start with something simple. Let's look at a text editor. Think of maybe Microsoft Word even. What's its job? Well, it all revolves around the text on the page. Whether it is which items are bolded, which items are underlined, the spacing, and all the rest, all of that is data, and it all revolves around that data that you give it. And maybe right now you're saying, okay, sure, line up business applications, the basic applications, would use data a lot, and they're kind of centered around data. But certain applications aren't. For example, a game. A game is not based around data. Well, really, yes, it is. Let's take, for example, chess. Chess is all data. You've got pieces in certain locations. So you have what the piece is, what it can do, and where it's located. Then you have the game board and where each piece is in relation to each other on that game board. And then you have the moves and where the pieces go. That's all data. And sure, that's chess, but if we look at a more complex or a larger example, say a first-person shooter game, how can that possibly be data? Well, you have to know where your character is and where every other character is, the system does, in order to know when you shoot a bullet, first of all, where it's going to go, that's data. How fast it's going to get there, that's data. And when it gets there, who it's going to hit, if anybody. If it hits somebody, how much damage does it do, that's data. You start seeing all the data that goes on behind the scenes sometimes, but still is fundamental to the application. It's all about that data. Again, looking at that first-person shooter game, what's the end result you want to see? A victory. How do you determine victory? Based upon the data that says, all my foes have been conquered. So data is very important. And that's why I start with my data. I will often find that it's easier to develop my front-end user interface once I have my data, because I see what needs to be done, and then it's just a matter of how I accomplish that instead of just drawing from a blank slate with no information. All right, so that's enough theory. Let's get into actually mapping out our data. Before we get started in this lesson, I want to take a quick minute to help you out. If you're anything like me, you probably have a friend or relative who thinks that because you do something with computers, you must know how to fix their computer. I don't know how many computers I've fixed over the years, so I decided to come up with a better solution. So I built a course that teaches anyone how to properly maintain their own computer. I call it PC Maintenance for the Rest of Us, and it costs just $29. I show people how to download free software to protect their computer, including an antivirus, a malware scanner, and online file storage applications. Then I show them how to use each one, as well as how to maintain their computer after it's cleaned up. So how does this help you? Well, what I do now is I tell people they have to buy this course, watch it, and do what it says before I'll work on their computers. That solves most of their problems, both now and in the future. And I can do the same for you. You will find a link for this course on iamtimcorey.com, as well as in the description below. Do what I do, and you will not only be helping me out, you'll be helping yourself out as well. Okay, let's get back to the lesson. Now, typically, I draw this out on a legal pad or my whiteboard, and both are great ways to visualize what needs to happen and at the same time, they're quick to change. Now that's kind of hard for me to show you on video. So instead, I'm going to kind of fast forward to when I'm done my design, but I'll walk you through it step by step. So when I do this development, there's a lot of scratch this out, move this around, erase this, draw a line through this, move this over here, because developing on paper is so easy to make changes. I would encourage you, and I started this course by saying, don't open Visual Studio yet. Do this development of the plan in Notepad, in your scratch pad, in a legal pad, on your whiteboard. Don't do it inside of code or inside of Visual Studio. And that still holds true here. I'm just going to show you the cleaned up end result of all that planning. And I'll walk you through some of the questions that I had, the thoughts that I had along the way. So this is really where I start, the blank page. And really, this can be intimidating at first because you don't know, where do I start? What's the best place to start? And the answer is really just put something down. And so I said, well, let's start with team. I know I need to have some kind of team that has people in it and has a team name and all the rest. So I started with team. And I said, on that team, we're going to have members. Now in parens, I put, this is the type that I think we're going to need to have. So I said, probably a list of type person. I don't have a person list yet. And maybe at that point, I'd pause and say, create a person list. But my focus is on, let's just get the team built first. Now, the other thing here is, I don't typically put types in until after I've come back through. But in this case, I'm showing you the end product. And so I put the types in there. But really what you want to do is you want to get all the information about a team down first before you do anything else. Don't worry about types for now, but do a second pass. After you got all the data in place, do a second pass and assign types to each one, just so you make sure you understand how this whole thing's going to work. Again, since I didn't have a type person yet, I'd make a note of that, but not actually develop the person class or the person group of information yet, because I'm focusing on team. If I leave team to build person, I might forget where I was in team and miss a key component. So always focus on one thing at a time. Everything else gets written down for later. So I have members. So that would be the number of people on a team, which could be one person. It's a one-person team, say for our ping pong tournament. Or it could be 5 people, say for a basketball team. Or it could be 20 people, maybe for some kind of office game. It doesn't really matter. What really matters is that we have that list that can have really 0 or more, but in our case, we kind of want to force it to have at least one person on the team. The team name. We know that each team has to have a name in order to call it something better than Tim, Bob, Mary, Sue. Oh, that might be a great team name. Who knows? And that'd be a string. So that's really all the team class is. So let's move on to person. Since we created this list of person, let's go ahead and now create that person object so we get that out of our mind too. We have a first name, which is a string. That's pretty straightforward. A last name, also a string. We could have asked for just name and had first and last name together, but I find that breaking that apart into 2 different properties or 2 different data points is, first of all, best practice in the industry, meaning the industry does this by default or does this most of the time, but also it makes it a whole lot easier for us to do things like have an email where it says, Dear Tim. It seems more personal that way instead of Dear Tim Corey. So breaking it apart into 2 different objects and having the user break that apart is very important. You could say, well, I know how to break a string apart based on the space. Therefore, Tim Corey could be in that variable, and I could break it apart and say the first part is the first name, the second part is the last name, which only works when a person only has one space in their full name. What if, for example, they said they had a last name that has space in it? Van space Wilder is the last name, Van Wilder. Well, that would come out as split apart. That's a problem. Wilder is not the last name. It's Van Wilder. First name is Joey. The same thing is true for first name. Maybe the first name is Mary Sue. Well, if the first name truly is Mary Sue, or they put Mary Sue as their first name, Mary Sue Smith, if we broke that apart, we'd say the first name is Mary, not Mary Sue. So breaking things apart can get ugly really quickly. Instead of breaking things apart later, you can put them together later. And that also allows you to do interesting things like last name, first name, or first initial, last name. Okay, let's look at the next property, email address. So we need to capture the person's email address, and that's also a string, and cell phone number. And that too is a string, and that trips some people up here. The idea that right in the name, cell phone number, and yet we're not saving it as some type of number, whether it's an int or a double or anything like that. We're storing it as a string. And the reason why is because we don't treat a cell phone number as if it were a number itself. So for example, the number, we can add to that, we can subtract from it, we can divide it, we can multiply it. But doing that to a cell phone number doesn't make sense. We wouldn't add 2 to a cell phone number for any reason. The cell phone number is what it is and it never changes. Also, we might want to store some type of formatting. For example, around the area code in the United States, we put parentheses, then we put a space, and then after the first 3 numbers of the actual phone number, we put a dash, and then the last 4. Well, you can't really do that and store it that way. And you might say, well, yeah, but I'll store it as just numbers. Well, that's great, but it still doesn't get past the idea of this isn't really a number to be manipulated. So we're going to store it as a string. Now, you may have caught me saying a couple times properties. And I want to stop for a minute and point that out. Really what we're doing here is we're creating our classes. So a team is going to be a class, person will be a class, and inside those classes will be these properties. Now, it's not a direct one-to-one matchup right now because, for example, cell phone number. I might change that to cell phone or phone number or something like that. But it's a pretty close matchup. Now, there may be other classes we create, but these are really our foundational classes on which the application gets built. These 2 plus the other we'll talk about in a minute. And I don't want you to get too caught up in the idea of code, but I do want you to be thinking about the fact that really these do map up pretty directly to classes, which is why I call these items properties. So just keep that in the back of your mind. When it comes to actually building our class library, having our data mapped out like this makes creating our foundation of our class library so very easy. Okay, back to our data. Our third class, or our third set of data, we'll call tournament. And this is all the data that surrounds the actual tournament, which is what this entire application is based upon. This is a tournament tracker. So this is going to be the central data hub, or the central bit that everything revolves around. So the first thing we need is a tournament name. Now that's not specified anywhere in the requirements, but we do mention the idea that there might be more than one tournament at a time. And so if there's more than one tournament, how do you know which tournament is which? You could look at who's playing in them and what round they're in and all the other details, but really that's so imprecise. So instead, we're going to specify that every tournament be given a name. That way you could say ping pong tournament, basketball tournament, and then you know exactly which tournament you're talking about. Next, we'll have an entry fee. Remember we talked about the idea that we could accept fees, or we could say that every person or every team needs to turn in a fee? Well, this entry fee is going to allow the administrator, the person that sets up a tournament, to say there is an entry fee to this tournament and it's $10 or whatever it is. And then every time we add a team to the tournament, we're going to charge that team the entry fee. So that would be of type decimal. And that's something else to point out. We'll get into more of the C# after we're actually inside Visual Studio. But for now, I just want to point out that because this is money, this entry fee, we should store it in type decimal, not double. On the surface, these 2 data types look very, very similar, decimal and double. They both store numbers that have a decimal point in them. The difference is precision. Decimal is very, very precise, but it also takes up a lot more memory. And so we typically only use this when we're talking about money. Double is a little less precise, but if you look at the actual precision, we're still precise to about, I believe it's 14 decimal places or 14 places after the decimal. That's good enough for me. But in the case of money, we really should have decimal. Okay, I mentioned that the entry fee is going to be charged, if there is one, to every team that enters the tournament, which means we have to have a list of teams in the tournament, or I called it entered teams that have entered the tournament. And that would be a list of type team. The great thing here is when we're developing this tournament, we're not thinking about, oh, I have to enter the first name and last name and email address and phone number of these people who were on teams and all the rest. We're just concentrated on what the tournament needs. Even if we hadn't yet created that team or that list of person called team members or anything else, we could say, I just need a list of teams. And then from there, we could say, okay, in a team, this is what I need. And then in a person, this is what I need. And so really when we're developing this data, we can't look too broadly. We have to focus on just what makes sense for this particular object or this particular chunk of the data. What goes together? In this case, we're talking about tournament. So the name of the tournament, the entry fee, the entered teams, and then also the prizes. The list of prizes contains just that, a list of prize. What's a prize? Well, we talked about the idea of having, for first place you get half the money, or first place you get $50, whatever we want to do is in setup. So we need to have a list of those. And this list, it truly is a 0 or more list. Maybe we don't have any prizes. Maybe we have 1, maybe we have 15. The next property for our tournament is going to be rounds. And this one's a bit tricky. And you got to think through how this is going to work. Now, we haven't built the matchup object yet, but a matchup would be one team versus another team. So we're going to have a look from the middle out. So we have a matchup, that's one team versus another. We're going to have a list of those matchups per round. So we'll have a list of matchups that's round 1, another list of matchups that's round 2, another for round 3, 4, and so on. So one list represents one round. Therefore, we have a list of matchup. You get that? You might have to draw it out on paper to think it through. We have matchups, but then we have a set of matchups that represents one round. And this rounds property holds all the rounds. So it has multiple lists, one for each round. Thus, the list of a list of matchup. And that's really what the tournament object contains. And at this point, there's a couple things I want to point out. First of all, we don't have the prize object or the matchup object yet. That's okay. We've written those down as we need these. We'll get back to them. We're concentrating on tournament. The other thing I want to point out here is there's going to be data besides what you have here. You're going to miss stuff. You're going to not think things through all the way necessarily. There may be things that you need for certain things. For example, in SQL, which is where you want to store our data, one of the places, typically what you do is you have a unique identifier for every row in a table. Well, probably team will be a table, and person will be a table, and tournament will be a table. And so each of these will probably have a unique identifier. Now, there are certain things that we call natural keys we could use for identifiers. For example, in tournament name kind of specifies, this is this tournament and not one of 3 tournaments called this. So for example, you wouldn't have 3 different tournaments all called basketball tournament because he couldn't identify which one was which. Therefore, you'd say men's basketball tournament, women's basketball tournament, mixed basketball tournament. There's 3 different ones. And so the tournament name would be unique across all the tournaments. That could be a natural key. I'm not a big fan of natural keys. I like to create my own. And so it'd be something I'd call ID and be just a counter, 1, 2, 3, 4. It makes it a little easier for indexing, and it's just easier to work with that. And so really, we're missing that ID property probably on all 3 of these. And that's okay. If you notice that, you can go back and put that on all of the places where you need it. But you're going to miss something. And that's what I want to get across to you, is the idea of it's okay. You may miss stuff. You don't have to get this 100% right. Don't stress out about it. Instead, do your best, think it through. Don't rush through it, for sure, but make sure that you at least get everything that you know and a little more in here. Do some research. Look at what other people do or what information other people capture in these type of situations. For example, a simple example, the person class. Right now we're capturing first name, last name, email address, and cell phone number. Go find out what other people do when they're capturing a person. And you may say, I have no clue where to look. Well, think about Amazon. When you sign up for an account at Amazon, Amazon asks you for certain information. What is that information? Not the billing information, the personal information. For example, they're going to ask things like where you live. They might ask for 2 different phone numbers, a home phone and a cell phone. Or they might ask you to tell them what type of phone number you're giving them. They might ask for a middle name or middle initial. Another place you could go look would be a contact on your phone. Go into contacts and say add new contact, and look at all the information that you can add about a contact, because a contact is really just a person. And you don't have to do everything that everybody else does. In fact, please don't. But it's a really good idea to look through some examples to say, no, I don't need that. No, I don't need that. Oh, I didn't think about this one. Maybe I do need that one. And that'll just help you better visualize what data you need up front. But once you've done that, again, don't stress out about, I have to look at 10 more examples to make sure I don't miss anything. That's not what this process is about. We're going to make mistakes, and it's okay. In fact, I know in my planning, I've made mistakes. In fact, when we get to lesson 5, I'll point out a couple of my mistakes that I've made in this process so far. And you know what? It's okay, because we can work through it. Now, I caught that still in the planning stage, which is good because it's easier to change things in planning than it is once we start developing. But you know what? Even in development, I'll capture more errors or more things that I've missed, and we'll figure out how to handle it at that point. Is it as convenient as handling it now? No. But you know what? You can't ever get things perfect up front. If you try to do that, you'll spend way too much time planning, and you'll never get your application out the door. And a well-planned application that's still on your legal pad is useless. What you need is something out the door. So there is that balance of, we should definitely plan before we start building, but we don't want to get so bogged down in planning that we don't build. So that's just the tension we're going to work through. But the big keynote here that I want to point out again and again is, don't worry. Don't overthink it. Okay, so let's move on. We know we have prize and matchup are 2 more objects we need to create in order to support the tournament object. Let's start with the prize object. Inside the prize object, we have a place number, and that's an int or a number. So what the place number is we're talking about first place, second place, third place. And we represent that with just a number. 1 represents first place, 2, second place, 3, third place. So if I said the place number is 10, what place is that? Well, it's the 10th place. So it's pretty straightforward. There's not any kind of matchup you have to do. We understand number 1 is first place. Next, we have place name. So this is where we're going to specify what that place is called. And you might think, wait a minute, we just said what those places are: first place, second place, third place. But maybe we want to call it champion is first place. Second place we call first runner up. You see how that terminology might be a little bit different? So we'll put that in this string field. The administrator, when they're setting up the tournament, they can specify anything they want for that place name. And then we'll use that when we're talking about the prizes that were won. So Tim won the championship and got $50. Or Tim was the first runner up and earned $25. So that's that place name. It's just a name that we are given to describe that place. And it could be first or second. So now we have the amount. Again, this is money, so it's a decimal. And that prize amount is how much in dollars we're going to assign to this place. And if you're remembering your requirements for this application, we said it's either a flat amount or it's a percentage. And so I also created the prize percentage property, and that's a type double. So for example, 0.5 would be 50%. So if you remember back to requirements, we said it's either a prize amount, a fixed amount, or it's a percentage. So how do we represent that in this prize object? Well, some of that comes down to, we'll probably have some kind of read-only property, but also if prize amount is 0 and prize percentage is 0.5, we know it's 50%. If the prize amount is $20 and the prize percentage is 0, we know that the prize is $20. And so we'll use that idea of one is 0, therefore the other one is the one that we use. And if both are 0, we have no prize, which doesn't really make sense that we then create that, but maybe we do. But that would be the prize object. A place, a name, an amount, and a percentage. Now on to the matchup object. And in the matchup object, we have entries, which is a list of matchup entry. What's a matchup entry? We'll get to that. But the idea is that a matchup entry would be one person. And so we'll have more than one person in a matchup. Obviously, we'll have at least two. And in fact, this system is designed for just two. But we'll still have that called a list. Then we have a winner. We're going to specify which team is the winner. We're going to put that in its own property. That way we can pull out information about the winner, like their email address to email them, or that kind of thing. So it makes it just a little bit easier if we have that winner property. And then we also have a round number. Is this matchup for round 1, for round 2, for round 18? What is it? And that's it. So now we have this matchup entry. And this is where we describe what we have in that list of matchup entry, those entries, what they really mean. First, we have a team competing. So it's one team. So that represents this entry in the matchup is one team. Their score, if they have any, it'd start at 0. But then once we mark them as their score, then we know. And then the parent matchup. So what I did here, originally I had team 1 and team 2 up in the matchup object. And I said we only ever have two teams. But then I had team 1 score, team 2 score. And that didn't fit right with me. The idea that we had properties that were mirrored for two different teams for their information. I didn't really like that. And so what I decided was, I'm going to create a list, even though there'll only be two. I'll create a list, and then I'll create an object for each entry so I can have multiple data points about that entry in one object. And one of the ways this helps me is I can reorder that list based upon things like score. So I can say, give me the top one matchup entry, order by score. And if the score goes the opposite direction, meaning it's like golf where the low score wins, I can say take the entries list, which is that list of matchup entry, order it descending by score, which would give me a low score first, and then it's giving me the first person. And that gives me the winner, which I can put in the winner object, and it allows me to then say other things as well, order by something else. The other thing it allows me to do, though, is it keeps the team competing, their score, and where they came from altogether. Now that where they came from is kind of important. That's what I call the parent matchup. So this is in round 2, we know that this team came from this other matchup in round 1. So round 1 was played, team 1 played team 2. Team 1 lost. Therefore, team 2 goes on to round 2. So team 2 has their matchup entry. They'll have a score of 0 to start, but they'll have a parent matchup of their win from round 1. That way we can link a winner all the way back through the different rounds. So it's going to be a bit confusing, I know, but this is my idea of how to deal with that whole matchup and which teams and all the rest, how to deal with that in a way that makes sense, or at least it makes sense to me. And we'll see as we put it down in actual code how it works out in the application. You know what? Right here we have all of our data we need for our application, or at least the broad strokes of all of our data we need for application. These 6 classes are what the application is going to revolve around. And we're done. So now we've developed our data plan. What's coming up next? Well, up next, we're going to develop our user interface. We're going to draw out our forms. So that's lesson 4. That's coming up next. Stay tuned for that. Before you go, you'll see a link on the left to buy this course. Check out the intro video on this playlist for more information about what you get if you pay. Also, if you are ever wondering what you could do to help this channel out without paying money, I've listed 6 things that really help. I'd appreciate if you consider doing 1 or more of these. Thanks again, and don't forget to keep practicing what you learned.